The cobblestone floors of a 19th-century estate kitchen are no place for the immaculate broadcloth of a nobleman. Yet, in the dead of winter in 1884, His Grace, Austin Stirling, Duke of Wycliffe, found himself doing the unthinkable. He was not holding court in his gilded library, nor was he addressing his peers in the House of Lords. He was sitting on the freezing, soot-stained flagstones of his own scullery, his back against a cold brick oven, shoulder to shoulder, with a sobbing, lowly maid. He had walked down into the dark, hoping to catch a petty thief. Instead, he unearthed a 5-year-old conspiracy that would shatter his aristocratic world to its very foundations. Wycliffe Manor stood like a limestone fortress against the biting winds of the Somerset countryside, its towering chimneys piercing the grey November sky. Within its walls, time seemed to have stopped precisely 5 years ago. Austin Stirling, the 9th Duke of Wycliffe, was a man carved from the very ice that frosted his estate's grand windows. At 34, he possessed the sharp, patrician features expected of his lineage: a strong jaw, piercing, storm-grey eyes, and a stature that commanded absolute obedience. But those who looked closely could see the hollowness beneath the aristocratic veneer. Austin was a ghost haunting his own life, a man entirely consumed by an unspoken, unhealed grief. 5 years prior, his young wife, Lady Rosalind, had perished during a retreat to a secluded country cottage. The official report from the county physician stated it was a sudden, violent fever that had claimed both Rosalind and the unborn child she carried. Austin had not been by her side. He had been summoned to London on urgent parliamentary business, a trip orchestrated by his closest confidant and financial adviser, Lord Silas Harrington. By the time Austin's carriage had torn through the muddy roads back to Somerset, his wife was already laid in a cold, sealed cedar coffin. Since that day, Austin had banished all warmth from the manor. He forbade the lighting of roaring fires in the great hall. He ordered the heavy velvet drapes drawn against the sun, and he demanded absolute silence from his staff. The servants moved through the corridors like frightened mice, terrified of catching the Duke's eye. The household was ruled with an iron fist by Mrs. Gable, a severe, hawkish housekeeper, who ensured the Duke's oppressive standards were met. It was within this suffocating, silent world that a new scullery maid arrived. Her name was Beatrice Croft. Beatrice was a frail thing, small and perpetually covered in the grey ash of the hearths she was assigned to clean. In the rigid hierarchy of the downstairs staff, she was at the absolute bottom, a creature of the shadows who scrubbed pots until her knuckles bled and slept on a thin pallet in the draftiest corner of the attic. She never spoke unless spoken to, and even then, her voice was barely a whisper. She kept her face hidden behind a curtain of mousy brown hair, her gaze eternally fixed on the floorboards. Austin first noticed her not as a person, but as a disruption of his melancholy. It was a bleak Tuesday afternoon, and he had been walking through the portrait gallery, a space he usually avoided because it housed a painting of Rosalind. As he passed, he saw Beatrice on her hands and knees, scrubbing the intricately patterned parquet floor. What caught his attention was not her presence, but the erratic, trembling nature of her movements. She was scrubbing the floor with a frantic, desperate energy, her breath catching in her throat in quiet, jagged gasps. As Austin paused, obscured by the shadows of a marble bust, he noticed her hands. The sleeves of her rough linen uniform were pushed up, revealing forearms marred by thick, silver scars, burn marks that looked old, yet horrific in their severity. Mrs. Gable's sharp voice suddenly echoed down the hall. "Girl, you're missing the corners. Do you think His Grace pays for half measures?" Beatrice flinched, as if struck by a whip, her scarred hands dropping the scrub brush. I apologize, Mrs. Gable. I will remedy it." Austin watched, a strange, uncharacteristic flicker of curiosity piercing his usual apathy. The girl's voice, though shaking with terror, possessed a peculiar cadence. It was not the rough, uneducated lilt of the local village girls who usually filled the scullery ranks. There was a softness to her vowels, an articulation that hinted at a different life, long forgotten. But the moment passed. Austin turned on his heel and retreated to his study, locking the heavy oak doors behind him, eager to drown his fleeting curiosity in a glass of amber scotch. He did not know that this brief observation was the first thread unraveling a perfectly woven tapestry of lies. Sleep was a luxury Austin Sterling rarely afforded. His nights were plagued by night terrors, visions of a faceless woman reaching out to him from the depths of a dark, rising river. On the night of November 14th, the insomnia was particularly unforgiving. The manor was dead silent, the clocks chiming a mournful 2 a.m. Restless, Austin threw off his heavy silk counterpane, donned his dark velvet dressing gown over his sleeping trousers, and began to pace. The fire in his chamber had died down to glowing embers, offering no comfort. He decided to seek a distraction, perhaps a forgotten book in the library, or a glass of water from the kitchens. Lighting a single silver candlestick, he ventured out into the cavernous, silent hallways. As he descended the servants' staircase, a narrow, unadorned spiral of stone that he had not set foot on in over a decade, he heard it. A sound, entirely out of place in the silent, sleeping house. It was a weeping, not the soft, performative tears of a reprimanded servant, but deep, soul-tearing sobs that echoed off the damp stone walls. The sound was raw, choked with an agony that Austin, intimately acquainted with despair, recognized instantly. He followed the sound down the final flight of steps, his velvet slippers making no noise on the flagstones. He pushed open the heavy oak door, leading into the vast, cavernous kitchen. The room was cold, smelling of stale bread, damp earth, and old ash. The massive brick ovens stood like black, gaping maws against the far wall. There, crumpled on the freezing floor beneath the faint moonlight filtering through a high, barred window, was the scullery maid, Beatrice. She was curled into a tight ball, her forehead pressed against the soot-stained bricks of the cold hearth. Her small frame shook violently with each sob. In her scarred hands, she clutched something tightly to her chest, a small, dark object that caught the meager light. Austin stood frozen in the doorway. Every rule of Victorian society, every dictate of his noble birth, screamed at him to turn around, to summon Mrs. Gable, to have this hysterical creature removed from his house for disturbing the peace. A duke did not fraternize with the downstairs staff, let alone a scullery maid having a midnight breakdown in the ashes. But the sound of her crying, the sheer, unadulterated heartbreak of it, paralyzed him. It was the sound he had wanted to make for 5 years, but had swallowed down in the name of aristocratic dignity. Before his rational mind could stop him, Austin stepped forward. "Who goes there?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse, though softer than he intended. Beatrice gasped, a sharp, terrified intake of breath. She scrambled backward, her back hitting the cold brick oven. In the dim light of his single candle, Austin saw her eyes, wide, bloodshot, and paralyzed with absolute terror. She tried to hide the object in her hand behind her back, her scarred arms shaking violently. "Please," she stammered, not recognizing his face in the heavy shadows, seeing only the silhouette of a tall man. "I meant no harm. I couldn't sleep. The cold. The cold makes the ache worse. I am sorry, sir. Please do not tell Mrs. Gable." Austin took another step forward, lowering the candle slightly so the light illuminated his face. The reaction was instantaneous. Beatrice's eyes widened to an impossible degree, and all the color drained from her dirt-smudged face. She tried to stand to curtsy, but her legs betrayed her, and she slumped back against the oven, trembling like a trapped rabbit. "Your Grace," she whispered, the words barely escaping her throat. She pressed her face toward the dirty floor, a gesture of ultimate submission and fear. "Forgive me. I am a wretched creature. I will pack my things tonight." Austin looked down at her. He looked at his immaculate velvet dressing gown, his expensive silk trousers. He looked at the soot and grease coating the uneven flagstones. Then, deliberately, defying every law of the world he was born into, Austin Sterling slowly bent his knees and sat down. He sat on the filthy kitchen floor, leaning his back against the brick wall, a mere 2 feet away from the trembling maid. Beatrice stopped breathing entirely. She slowly lifted her head, staring at the Duke as if he had suddenly grown horns. A Duke, sitting in the ashes. It was a sight so bizarre, so incomprehensible, it temporarily halted her tears. "I find," Austin said quietly, staring straight ahead at the dark pantry doors, "that the silence of this house is sometimes louder than a cannon. Why are you crying, girl?" It is nothing, Your Grace. A bad dream. Only a bad dream." "I am an expert in bad dreams," Austin replied, his voice devoid of its usual icy edge, replaced by a hollow exhaustion. "And I know the difference between a nightmare and a memory. You are holding something. What is it?" Beatrice's hands instinctively clamped tighter behind her back. "Nothing of consequence, Your Grace." "Do not lie to me," he commanded softly. "I am sitting in the soot with you. The least you can do is offer me the truth." Slowly, hesitantly, Beatrice brought her hands forward, her scarred fingers uncurled. Lying in her palm was a small, scorched piece of heavy parchment, the edges blackened and curled. But it wasn't the paper that caught Austin's eye. It was the wax seal holding a torn ribbon to the paper. A seal pressed into dark crimson wax. The crest of the Harrington family, a serpent coiled around a sword. Austin's breath hitched. Silas Harrington's seal. Silas, his closest friend. Silas? The man who managed his estates, who had consoled him at Rosalind's funeral. "Where did you get that?" Austin demanded, his voice suddenly tight, the aristocratic command rushing back. Beatrice shrank away, tears spilling over her lashes once more. "I salvaged it from the fire. 5 years ago. The night my mother was murdered." Austin turned his head sharply, locking eyes with the maid. The shadows in the kitchen seemed to lengthen, the temperature dropping a dozen degrees. "Your mother?" "I am not who you think I am, Your Grace," Beatrice whispered, the dam breaking, her words pouring out in a rushed, terrified whisper. "My name is not Beatrice Croft. I am Beatrice Miller. My mother was Nora Miller, the midwife of Oakhaven Village." Oakhaven. The name hit Austin like a physical blow to the chest, Oakhaven was the isolated village where the cottage was located. The cottage where Rosalind had gone for the fresh air. The cottage where she had died. The midwife. Austin breathed, the world tilting precariously on its axis. The midwife, who attended my wife. She didn't just attend her, Your Grace? Beatrice cried, the tears flowing freely now, carving clean lines through the soot on her cheeks. She tried to save her, and they killed her for it. They burned our house to the ground with her inside it. I barely escaped with my life. She lifted her arms, displaying the horrific silvery burn scars. Austin's hands began to tremble. He stared at the Harrington seal in the girl's hand. "Tell me," he commanded, his voice barely a rasp. "Tell me everything. Right now." The kitchen was so silent, Austin could hear the frantic beating of his own heart. He sat rigidly against the cold brick, his eyes fixed on the weeping girl beside him. The velvet of his robe was absorbing the dampness of the floor, but he felt nothing but a rising, terrifying cold in his veins. "I was 16, Beatrice began, her voice shaking, staring blankly at the dark stones as the memories pulled her back. October of 1879. The storms that autumn were vicious, flooding the roads. My mother, Nora, was the most respected midwife in the county. We lived quietly on the edge of the woods, far from the manor houses. But the nobility, they came to her when discretion was required. Austin stiffened. My wife was not seeking discretion. She was sent there for the clean air. Her lungs were weak. Beatrice looked at him, a profound, devastating pity in her swollen eyes. It was a look no servant should ever give a duke. "Your Grace, Lady Rosalind's lungs were perfectly fine. She was terrified." "Terrified of what?" "Of the man who brought her to the cottage." Beatrice took a shuddering breath. "You were in London. Lady Rosalind arrived at the Oakhaven cottage in the dead of night in a carriage without your family crest. She was accompanied by a gentleman, a tall man, with sharp features and a walking stick with a silver hound's head. Silas. Silas Harrington used a silver hound's head cane." Austin's hands clenched into fists in his lap, the fingernails biting into his palms. "Lord Harrington was ensuring her safe passage. I asked him to." "He did not leave her there to rest, Your Grace," Beatrice whispered. "He locked her in. My mother was summoned 2 days later. Lady Rosalind had gone into early, agonizing labor. I accompanied my mother, as I always did, carrying the boiling water and the linens. When we arrived at the cottage, Lord Harrington was pacing the parlor. He looked furious, not worried, furious." Beatrice closed her eyes, the tears squeezing out from beneath her lashes. "We went into the bedroom. Lady Rosalind was thrashing, drenched in sweat. But my mother, she took one look at her, smelled her breath, and stopped dead. She turned to me and whispered, 'This is not her natural labor. B. She has been poisoned. Hemlock and bitter rue.'" "No," Austin choked out, the word tearing from his throat. "No, the physician, Dr. Vance, no, wait, Dr. Arris. Dr. Arris signed the death certificate. He said it was a sudden fever, puerperal fever." "Dr. Arris was paid, Your Grace," Beatrice said, her voice gaining a desperate strength. "My mother tried to save her. She brewed antidotes. She forced milk and charcoal down the lady's throat. For hours we fought. Lady Rosalind, in her lucid moments, grabbed my mother's arm. She was crying out for you. She said, 'Tell Austin it was a lie. The debts are a lie. Silas is bleeding the estate.'" Austin felt the oxygen leave the room. Silas Harrington had been managing the Wycliffe finances for a decade. Recently, Silas had presented Austin with ledgers showing massive, unexplainable losses, urging Austin to sell off parcels of land to cover debts Austin couldn't remember incurring. Rosalind, brilliant and sharp-minded Rosalind, had always possessed a keen head for numbers. She had spent weeks in the library before her sudden illness. She found out. Austin whispered to himself, the horrifying puzzle pieces snapping together with bone-crunching force. She found the discrepancies. She threatened him. Yes. Beatrice nodded, wiping her nose with the back of her scarred hand. In the early hours of the morning, the child was born. A boy, Your Grace. Born too early, silent and still. Lady Rosalind held him to her chest, and she wept until her heart simply gave out. The poison was too much. She died as the sun came up. Austin let his head fall back against the brick wall. A son. He had a son. A son he never knew, dead before he took a breath. And Rosalind, his beautiful, fierce Rosalind, murdered in a lonely cottage while he sat in a parliamentary debate debating grain taxes. A sound escaped him. A ragged, horrific sound of a man being torn apart from the inside. Beatrice flinched, but continued, knowing the truth had to be entirely lanced like a festering wound. Lord Harrington came into the room when the crying stopped. He saw my mother packing her satchel. He asked if it was done. My mother, brave, foolish woman. She turned to him and spat in his face. She told him he was a murderer, and that she would ride to the magistrate herself. What did he do? Austin asked, his voice dead, devoid of all emotion, a terrifying calm settling over him. He smiled. Beatrice sobbed. He just smiled and let us leave. We went back to our cottage in the woods. That night, I woke up to the smell of smoke. The front door had been barred from the outside. The thatched roof was entirely ablaze. My mother pushed me toward a small window in the pantry. She couldn't fit. She shoved me through, screaming at me to run into the woods and never look back. As I crawled through, the burning roof collapsed. I burned my arms trying to reach back in for her. She looked down at the twisted flesh of her forearms. I hid in the forest for 3 days. I watched from the trees as Lord Harrington's men sifted through the ashes of my home. I knew if I went to the authorities, they would kill me too. Lord Harrington is too powerful. So I ran. I changed my name. I starved on the streets of London, and eventually I made my way back here. To Wycliffe. Why? Austin turned his head, his grey eyes locking onto the maid. Why come to the very house of the man whose wife's murder you witnessed? Why risk it? Because, Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a fierce, trembling whisper, holding out the scorched parchment with the Harrington seal. Before she pushed me out the window, my mother shoved this into my pocket. It was a note she found on the floor of the cottage bedroom, dropped by Lord Harrington. I can't read, Your Grace, but I knew the seal. I came here to find you, to show it to you. But when I arrived, I saw how close you were with Lord Harrington. He's dined at your table. He drank your wine. I was terrified you were part of it, that you had ordered her death. Austin felt a sickening jolt. He had dined with his wife's murderer for 5 years. He had shaken his hand, thanked him for his condolences, trusted him with his fortune and his life. Austin slowly reached out and took the scorched paper from Beatrice's trembling hand. He brought it close to his candle. The handwriting was elegant, sharp, and undeniably Silas Harrington's. It was a brief directive, addressed to Dr. Aris. Aris, the Wycliffe woman has become a liability to our enterprise. I'm taking her to Oakhaven under the guise of the country air. See that you have the death certificate for puerperal fever prepared for Thursday morning. The Duke is safely in London. Ensure the local midwife is managed or removed. Austin read the words 3 times. The letters seemed to burn themselves onto his retinas. The heavy silence of the kitchen returned, save for the crackle of the parchment in his tightening grip. He had descended the stairs an hour ago as a hollow, grieving man, a victim of cruel fate. He sat on the floor now as something else entirely. The grief that had paralyzed him for 5 years evaporated, replaced by a cold, incandescent rage. Austin Sterling, Duke of Wycliffe, stood up. He brushed the heavy layer of kitchen soot from his velvet trousers with a deliberate, terrifying calmness. He looked down at the broken, scarred girl on the floor, the girl who had carried the truth through fire and starvation. "Beatrice," Austin said, his voice ringing with a newfound lethal authority that made the kitchen walls seem to vibrate. She looked up, terrified by the sudden change in him. The broken man was gone. The Duke had returned, but he was a weapon unsheathed. "Stand up," he commanded gently. Beatrice scrambled to her feet, wincing as her stiff legs bore her weight. "You will not sleep in the attic tonight," Austin stated, his eyes dark and absolute. "You will sleep in the guest chambers in the east wing. I will personally lock the door. Tomorrow, Mrs. Gable will be dismissed." And then, Beatrice. Austin turned toward the kitchen door, his grip on the scorched letter tight enough to turn his knuckles white. "You and I are going to hunt a wolf." Dawn broke over Wycliffe Manor, not with the gentle hues of morning, but with a cold, piercing grey that mirrored the sudden, sharp clarity in Austin Sterling's mind. True to his word, Austin had escorted Beatrice from the freezing scullery to the east wing, a corridor draped in Holland covers and untouched since Rosalind's passing. He bypassed the modest guest rooms and led her to a grand suite with a heavy oak door. He lit the fire himself, hands trembling not from the chill, but from the adrenaline flooding his veins. He ordered her to lock the door from the inside and not to open it for anyone but him. By 7 o'clock, the entire household was thrown into unprecedented chaos. The Duke, who had not been seen outside his private quarters before noon in 5 years, was standing in the center of the great hall, fully dressed in a tailored midnight blue morning coat, his storm-grey eyes flashing with a terrifying, absolute authority. "Mrs. Gable." Austin's voice boomed, echoing off the vaulted ceilings and sending a flock of startled housemaids scurrying behind the mahogany staircase. The severe housekeeper materialized from the servants' corridor, her usual scowl faltering at the sight of her master. "Your Grace." "It is barely past dawn. The fires are not yet." "You are dismissed, Mrs. Gable," Austin interrupted, his voice a blade of cold steel. Mrs. Gable blinked, the color draining from her sallow cheeks. "Dismissed? Your Grace, I do not understand. Have I displeased you?" "You have maintained a house of terror rather than a home of order," Austin stated, stepping closer. The sheer physical presence of the man, radiating an icy, contained fury, made the housekeeper physically step back. "You have 1 hour to pack your belongings. My valet will provide you with 3 months' severance, drawn from the Wycliffe accounts at Coutts & Co. If you are found on these grounds past 8 o'clock, I will have the groundskeeper remove you with the hounds. Am I understood?" Mrs. Gable opened her mouth, but the absolute murder in the Duke's eyes silenced her. She curtsied unsteadily and fled. With the tyrant of the downstairs removed, Austen turned his attention to the true architect of his misery. He strode down the long corridor to the estate office, a room he had largely ceded to Lord Silas Harrington. Silas treated the office as his own personal fiefdom during his frequent visits to Somerset, keeping his ledgers locked in a heavy, iron-banded mahogany desk. Austen did not bother searching for a key. He retrieved a heavy iron poker from the fireplace grate and brought it down violently upon the brass log. The wood splintered with a satisfying crack. For 3 hours, Austen sat amidst the wreckage of the desk, dissecting 5 years of his own blindness. He pulled out ledgers, bank statements, and correspondence. The deeper he dug, the more the breath was forced from his lungs. Silas had not merely been skimming from the estate. He had been engaged in a wholesale, systematic butchery of the Wycliffe fortune. There were forged signatures transferring exorbitant sums to shadowy investment firms on Threadneedle Street. Silas, it appeared, had accrued massive, ruinous debts in the South African diamond mine speculations, a desperate gamble that had collapsed. To cover his tracks and save his own neck from the London moneylenders, Silas had used Austen's grief as a shield, liquidating Wycliffe lands and blaming phantom agricultural depressions. And Rosalind had found out. Austen held a ledger from 1879. There, tucked between the pages of October, was a sheet of paper covered in Rosalind's elegant, looping handwriting. It was a terrifyingly accurate calculation of Silas's embezzlements. "He is stealing from us, Austen," she had written in the margins. "I must confront him before he bankrupts the earldom. I will show him these numbers when he arrives for the harvest dinner." Austen crushed the paper to his chest, closing his eyes as a fresh wave of agony washed over him. She had confronted him, and Silas had silenced her permanently. Austen knew he could not simply ride to Silas's estate and shoot him. Silas Harrington was a powerful peer of the realm, deeply embedded in Parliament. An accusation of murder from a grieving duke, based on the testimony of a runaway scullery maid, and a burned piece of paper would be dismissed as madness. Silas would twist the narrative, paint Austen as a lunatic, and Beatrice would be quietly disposed of. No, a wolf could not be killed with a loud shout. It had to be caught in a trap of his own making. Austen moved to his private study and pulled out a sheet of thick, embossed Wycliffe stationery. He dipped his pen in the inkwell and drafted a telegram to the only man in London he knew possessed both the intellect to unravel this conspiracy and the moral fortitude to stand against a lord. It was a man Austen had met years ago during a parliamentary inquiry into the Whitechapel slums. To Inspector Frederick Aberline, Scotland Yard. Urgent matters of fraud and foul play require your immediate and absolute discretion. I am travelling to London. Meet me at Grosvenor Square on the 18th. Tell no one. Wycliffe. He sealed the envelope, summoned his most trusted rider, and dispatched him to the telegraph office. Then Austen walked back upstairs to the east wing. He unlocked the door to find Beatrice sitting rigidly in a velvet armchair, still clutching her ash-stained uniform. "Wash yourself, Beatrice," Austen said, his tone softening only slightly, the fire of vengeance burning bright in his eyes. "We are leaving for London within the hour. The shadows of this house can protect you no longer." The journey to London was a blur of driving rain and the rhythmic, thundering clatter of the Wycliffe private train carriage. Beatrice sat opposite the Duke, completely transformed. Before leaving Somerset, Austen had summoned the village seamstress and purchased an entire wardrobe of deep mourning attire. Heavy black silk gowns, high lace collars to cover the scars on her neck, and a thick widow's veil. To the outside world, she was Miss Beatrice Croft, a distant, grieving cousin of the late Duchess, taken under the Duke's charitable wing. Austen briefed her on the journey. When we arrive at Grosvenor Square, you are to play the part of a silent, bereaved relative. You will not speak to the London staff. You will observe. Silas knows the faces of every maid in my house, but he will not recognize the soot-stained girl from the kitchen beneath a veil of Chantilly lace. Beatrice nodded, her scarred hands gripping the rich silk of her skirt. "What are you going to do, Your Grace?" "I am going to invite the spider into his own web," Austen replied coldly. The Wycliffe townhouse in Grosvenor Square, Mayfair, was a monument to aristocratic wealth. When the carriage pulled up to the grand Georgian facade, the London staff, startled by the Duke's unannounced arrival, scrambled to light the gas lamps and open the drawing rooms. The moment Austen crossed the threshold, he set his trap in motion. He sent a handwritten note via courier to the Reform Club on Pall Mall, where he knew Silas took his afternoon brandy. Silas. I have arrived in London unexpectedly. I have been reviewing the estate ledgers and find myself utterly confused by some recent transactions regarding the Somerset tenant farms. I fear I am out of my depth without Rosalind's old notes. Please dine with me tonight at 8. I require your immediate counsel. It was the perfect bait. A mention of ledgers to incite panic, a mention of Rosalind's notes to instill terror, and an appeal for help to stroke Silas's monumental ego. At precisely 7:30, a knock sounded at the heavy front doors. Austen stood by the marble fireplace in the drawing-room, a crystal glass of scotch in his hand. He had positioned Beatrice in a high-backed armchair, in the dimmest corner of the room, her face entirely obscured by her black veil. She looked like a shadow, a ghost of Wycliffe past. "Lord Harrington, Your Grace," the butler announced. Silas Harrington strode into the room. He was a striking man in his early 40s, impeccably dressed in evening tails, carrying his signature walking stick adorned with a silver hound's head. His smile was smooth, practiced, and entirely devoid of warmth. "Austen, my dear fellow," Silas exclaimed, stepping forward with his arms extended. "What a tremendous surprise. I had no idea you were leaving the country. You look remarkably well." Austen forced his muscles to relax, though every fibre of his being screamed to wrap his hands around Silas's throat and squeeze until the life left his eyes. He managed a weary, tragic smile. "Silas, thank you for coming on such short notice. The ghosts in Somerset were becoming too loud." Silas clapped Austen on the shoulder, a gesture that made Austen's stomach churn. "Of course, Austen. I'm always at your disposal. You mentioned the ledgers in your note. Surely such tedious matters could wait." "I'm afraid not," Austen said, turning to pour Silas a glass of brandy. "I found a hidden compartment in Rosalind's old writing desk. It contained some fascinating calculations regarding Coutts Bank and Threadneedle Street." Austen did not turn around, but he heard the microscopic hitch in Silas's breath. The faint clink of Silas's silver-headed cane hitting the floorboard stopped dead. "Is that so?" Silas said, his voice dropping half an octave, the jovial tone evaporating. "Rosalind was always prone to fanciful accounting. What exactly did she write?" We can discuss it over the roast, Austin said smoothly, turning back with the glass. He gestured toward the dark corner of the room. Forgive my rudeness. Silas, allow me to introduce my late wife's distant cousin, Miss Croft. She suffered a terrible tragedy recently. A fire took her family. I have offered her sanctuary here in London. Silas turned, his eyes narrowing as he peered into the shadows. Beatrice sat perfectly still, the heavy black veil completely masking her face. Only her hands were visible, resting in her lap, tightly clad in black silk gloves to hide the burns. A pleasure, Miss Croft, Silas said smoothly, though his eyes darted back to Austin with a flicker of suspicion. A fire, you say? How dreadful. I'm intimately familiar with how destructive fires can be in the country. Beatrice did not speak. She merely inclined her head, a silent, ghostly nod. Miss Croft's vocal cords were damaged by the smoke. Austin lied flawlessly, stepping between Silas and Beatrice. She cannot speak, but she is an excellent listener. Dinner was a psychological battlefield disguised as a polite aristocratic gathering. They sat at the long mahogany table, the silver candelabras casting dancing shadows across the fine china. Austin skillfully steered the conversation toward the past, poking at the edges of the 5-year-old lie. Do you ever think of that night, Silas? Austin asked casually, cutting into his beef Wellington. The night Rosalind passed, you were the one who arranged the cottage in Oakhaven, were you not? Silas paused, his silver fork hovering in the air. His eyes, dark and calculating, locked onto Austin's. The easy camaraderie was gone, replaced by a predatory stillness. I did, Silas replied, his tone measured carefully. The physician recommended country air. It was a tragedy, Austin. We have discussed this 1,000 times. Dr. Aris assured us there was nothing anyone could have done. Ah, yes, Dr. Aris, Austin mused, taking a slow sip of his wine. Funny you should mention him. I received a telegram from Dr. Aris just this morning. He seemed quite distressed. It was a bluff, a massive, dangerous gamble. But Austin needed to see Silas's reaction. The colour drained entirely from Silas Harrington's face. The charming facade shattered, revealing the desperate, cornered animal beneath. His grip on his wine glass tightened until his knuckles turned white. He had clearly underestimated the ghost duke. Distressed? Silas asked, his voice tight. About what? Before Austin could deliver the killing blow, a sharp, violent sound shattered the tense atmosphere of the dining room. Crash. Silas and Austin whipped their heads around. At the far end of the table, Beatrice had knocked over her heavy, crystal water goblet. The water spilled across the damask tablecloth like a spreading stain. But it wasn't an accident. Beatrice had half risen from her chair, her gloved hands gripping the edge of the table. She was staring directly at Silas, her chest heaving beneath the heavy black silk. The sheer terror radiating from her was palpable. Silas stared at the veiled woman, his brow furrowing. He looked at her gloved hands, at the posture of her shoulders. Something in his cunning, vicious mind clicked. Miss Croft, Silas said softly, the words sliding off his tongue like poison. Are you quite all right? You seem familiar to me. Austin stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floorboards, interposing himself between Silas and the trembling girl. The trap was sprung, but the prey had noticed the steel jaws. The real war had just begun. The dining room of the Grosvenor Square townhouse fell into a suffocating, graveyard silence. The spilled water dripped from the edge of the mahogany table, landing on the Persian rug with the rhythm of a ticking clock. Silas Harrington stood frozen, his dark eyes fixed on the veiled figure of Beatrice. The calculating gears in his mind were turning with frantic, desperate speed. He took a slow, deliberate step toward her. "Miss Croft, is it? Your hands. I have seen hands like that before in Somerset. A peculiar tragedy, that fire." Austin moved with the sudden lethal grace of a striking viper. He stepped squarely between Silas and Beatrice, his tall frame entirely blocking the other man's view. The polite veneer of the aristocrat vanished, replaced by the sheer, imposing dominance of the Duke of Wycliffe. "She is a survivor, Silas," Austin said, his voice dropping to a dangerously soft timbre. "Much like myself, we have both endured fires that should have consumed us. But the flames only burned away the illusions." Silas's gaze snapped up to Austin's face. For the first time in 5 years, the arrogant lord saw the truth in Austin's storm-grey eyes. The paralyzing grief was gone. In its place was a crystalline, terrifying knowledge. Silas realized in that split second that Austin was not fishing for information. He already had it. The mention of Dr. Aris, the ledgers, the veiled woman who flinched at his voice. It was not a coincidence. It was an executioner's block being prepared. Silas's charismatic smile stretched thin, turning into a rigid grimace. He pulled his gold pocket watch from his waistcoat, the metal clicking loudly in the quiet room. "Look at the hour. Austin, I must apologize profoundly. I have just remembered an urgent appointment with my solicitors at Lincoln's Inn. The matter of the agricultural depression simply cannot wait." "Of course," Austin replied, his face an impenetrable mask of stone. "We would not want your debts to compound any further. We shall resume this conversation very soon, Silas. I promise you that." Silas gave a stiff, jerky bow, completely ignoring Beatrice. He turned on his heel, his silver-headed cane striking the floor with uneven, hurried thuds. The heavy front door of the townhouse slammed shut a moment later, echoing through the halls like a gunshot. The moment he was gone, Beatrice collapsed back into her chair, tearing the black veil from her face. She was gasping for air, her chest heaving as a cold sweat plastered her mousy brown hair to her forehead. "He knows," she choked out, her scarred hands trembling violently. "Your Grace." He looked right through the veil. "He knows who I am." "I was counting on it," Austin said, turning back to the table and calmly pouring himself a fresh glass of wine. Beatrice stared at him, bewildered and terrified. "Counting on it? He will kill us. He will send his men tonight." "Let him try." A new, gruff voice echoed from the shadows of the drawing-room archway. Beatrice gasped, shrinking back as a stout man with a thick moustache and a sharp, observing gaze stepped into the gaslight. He wore a heavy tweed trench coat, completely incongruous with the opulent surroundings of the Wycliffe dining room. "Beatrice," Austin said gently, his tone softening to reassure her. "Allow me to introduce Inspector Frederick Aberline of Scotland Yard. He arrived through the servants' entrance while we were having our first course." Inspector Aberline tipped his bowler hat respectfully. "A pleasure, miss. His Grace sent a rather illuminating telegram this morning. I've spent the afternoon reviewing the financial records he brought from Somerset. Lord Harrington has been a very busy, very sloppy man." "Fraud is one thing, Inspector," Austin said, his eyes darkening. "Murder is another." "Indeed, Your Grace," Aberline agreed, stepping up to the table. A man cornered by financial ruin will lie. A man cornered by the gallows will act. Lord Harrington knows you have the missing piece of the puzzle right here in this house. He cannot flee the country without his hidden assets, and he cannot access those assets while you breathe, and this young lady can testify. He will strike tonight. He has to. And what is to stop him from succeeding? Beatrice whispered, her eyes darting toward the darkened windows. The entire Metropolitan Police Force. Abilene replied with a grim smile. I have 12 plainclothes officers stationed in the mews, the alleyways, and the neighboring gardens. But we cannot arrest a peer of the realm on suspicion and the word of a maid. Forgive me for saying so, miss. We need to catch him in the act. We need a confession, and for that, we need the bait. Austin turned to Beatrice. He knelt before her chair, just as he had done in the soot-stained kitchen. He took her trembling, scarred hands in his own, ignoring the ruined flesh, seeing only the immense, staggering courage of the woman who had brought him back to life. Beatrice, Austin said softly, his thumbs gently brushing her knuckles. I will not ask you to put yourself in harm's way again. I will have Abilene's men escort you to a secure hotel this very moment if you wish. But if we want Silas to hang for what he did to Rosalind, and for what he did to your mother, I need him to walk into my trap. Beatrice looked down at the Duke's hands holding hers. For 5 years, she had scrubbed his floors, terrified of his shadow. Now he was offering her the choice to destroy the monster that had haunted her nightmares. She thought of the smell of smoke, of the screaming timbers of her childhood home, and of her mother's final desperate push through the window. She looked up, her tears drying, replaced by a fierce, blazing resolve that made her grey eyes shine like polished steel. Tell me where to stand, Your Grace. Beatrice said steadily, let the wolf come. By midnight, a thick, choking London fog had rolled off the River Thames, wrapping Grosvenor Square in an impenetrable grey shroud. The Wycliffe townhouse was entirely dark, save for a single, dim gas lamp burning in the second-floor master bedroom. Inside the bedroom, the tension was thick enough to slice with a hunting knife. The grand four-poster bed was draped in heavy velvet curtains. Beneath the covers, a series of feather pillows had been arranged to mimic a sleeping figure. Beatrice was hidden inside the massive cedar wardrobe in the corner of the room, peering through a thin crack in the doors. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Austin stood pressed against the wall, behind the heavy mahogany bedroom door, completely cloaked in shadow. In his right hand, he held a heavy, cold Webley .455 service revolver, its hammer already pulled back with a silent click. In the adjoining dressing room, Inspector Aberline and 2 burly sergeants waited in absolute silence, notebooks in hand. The grandfather clock in the downstairs hall chimed 1 o'clock. The sound resonated through the floorboards like a death knell. 10 minutes later, it happened. There was no sound of a breaking window, no clumsy footsteps. Silas had retained a key to the servants' entrance from the days when Austin had trusted him implicitly. The first sign of his presence was the subtle, agonizingly slow turning of the brass doorknob to the bedroom. The door creaked open, revealing the silhouette of a tall man. It was Silas. He had abandoned his evening tales for a dark woolen overcoat. He stepped into the room with the practiced silence of a predator, closing the door softly behind him. The faint light from the street lamp outside caught the flash of drawn steel in his hand, a long, wicked hunting blade. Silas did not hesitate. He moved swiftly toward the four-poster bed, his eyes fixed on the lump beneath the blankets. He raised the blade high above his head, his face twisted into a mask of pure, vicious hatred, and brought it down with sickening force. The blade sank deep into the feather pillows, tearing the fabric with a loud rip. Silas froze, the resistance of the blade entirely wrong. He ripped the covers back, revealing the butchered pillows and a flurry of white feathers drifting into the air. "A disappointing kill, isn't it, Silas?" Austin's voice cut through the darkness like a whip. Silas whirled around, raising his knife, but stopped dead. Austin stepped out of the shadows, the barrel of the Webley revolver leveled squarely at the center of Silas's chest. "Austin!" Silas hissed, his eyes darting wildly around the room, searching for an escape. The charming aristocrat was entirely gone. In his place was a cornered, feral beast. "Have you gone mad? Pointing a gun at a lord of the realm?" "A lord?" Austin scoffed, his voice dripping with lethal contempt. "You are a parasite that has fed on my wealth and my family." Silas sneered, realizing the charade was over. His arrogance, the very flaw that had allowed him to manipulate Austin for so long, surged forward. He lowered the knife slightly, a cruel, mocking smile twisting his lips. "You always were a sentimental fool, Austin," Silas spat, "grieving in the dark for 5 years while I built an empire with your stagnant gold. Rosalind had to die. She was going to ruin everything. She poked her nose where it didn't belong. I gave her peace in that cottage." From inside the wardrobe, Beatrice pressed her hands over her mouth to stifle a sob, the confession hitting her like a physical blow. "And the midwife?" Austin demanded, keeping the gun perfectly steady. "Nora Miller. And the girl. Collateral damage." Silas shrugged, stepping slightly to the left, testing Austin's aim. "The old hag threatened to go to the magistrate. I barred the door and tossed the lantern myself. It was almost poetic." "They burned, Austin, while you sat in Parliament arguing about pennies. I controlled your life, I controlled your fortune, and I controlled your wife's final breaths." "Thank you, Lord Harrington." A new voice rang out. The door to the dressing room swung open. Inspector Aberline stepped out into the bedroom, a gas lantern in one hand and a notebook in the other. Behind him, the 2 police sergeants unholstered their truncheons. Silas's smug expression shattered into a million pieces. The color drained from his face, leaving him a ghastly, translucent white. He looked at Aberline, then back to the gun in Austin's hand, finally comprehending the sheer magnitude of the trap he had walked into. "I believe that is a full, uncoerced confession to embezzlement, arson, and a double murder," Aberline stated crisply, snapping his notebook shut. "Sergeants, place Lord Silas Harrington under arrest. If he resists, you have my permission to break his legs." Silas roared in fury, lunging toward the bedroom window, desperate to smash through the glass and risk the 2-story drop. But Austin moved faster. He stepped forward and drove the heavy steel butt of the Webley revolver directly into Silas's jaw. The sickening crunch of bone echoed in the room, and the lord crumpled to the floor, unconscious before he hit the Persian rug. Austin stood over the fallen man, his chest heaving, the ghost that had haunted him for 5 years finally, decisively exorcised. He lowered the gun and turned toward the wardrobe. He opened the door gently. Beatrice stepped out, trembling, tears streaming freely down her face. But they were no longer tears of terror. They were tears of relief, of a crushing weight finally lifted from her soul. Austin dropped the gun on a side table and, without a word, pulled her into a fierce, desperate embrace. Beatrice buried her face in his chest, her scarred hands gripping his coat. In the dark room, surrounded by feathers and the wreckage of a 5-year lie, the Duke and the scullery maid held on to each other, two survivors pulling themselves from the ashes. The subsequent weeks dismantled aristocratic society. The trial of Lord Silas Harrington at the Old Bailey was the scandal of the decade. Presiding over the case was the infamous Justice Sir Henry Hawkins, a man known for his merciless sentencing. Presented with Abeline's immaculate notes, the forged ledgers from Coates Bank, and the quiet, unbreakable testimony of Beatrice Miller, the jury took less than 20 minutes to reach a verdict. Sir Henry Hawkins donned the black cap and sentenced Silas Harrington to hang by the neck at Newgate Prison. When the trapdoor finally fell beneath Silas, taking his life and his lies with it, Austin and Beatrice were standing together in the courtyard, watching the black flag raised over the prison walls. The debt was paid. A year later, Wycliffe Manor was unrecognizable. The Holland covers had been burned, the heavy velvet drapes replaced with sheer lace that invited the golden Somerset sun into every hallway. The great hearths roared with warm, crackling fires. Austin Sterling stood in the centre of the Grand Library, no longer a ghost, but a man fully alive. The doors opened, and Beatrice walked in. She was no longer dressed in the rough linen of a scullery maid, nor the heavy black of mourning. She wore a stunning gown of deep emerald silk, her mousy hair styled elegantly, though she refused to wear gloves, wearing her silver scars with quiet, fierce pride. She was no longer Beatrice Croft, the maid. She was Beatrice Miller, the woman who had saved the Duke of Wycliffe. Austin crossed the room, his storm-grey eyes softening with an adoration that eclipsed the sun. He took her scarred hands, kissed her knuckles reverently, and pulled her close. They had both been burned by the cruelty of the world, but from the ashes they had forged something unbreakable. The fire that Silas Harrington ignited to conceal his crimes was meant to consume the truth, but it merely forged it into steel. Austin and Beatrice, bound by a tragedy that should have destroyed them both, found profound salvation in the very ashes of their pasts. Wycliffe Manor, once a mausoleum of silenced grief, was resurrected into a sanctuary of warmth and unyielding love. Beatrice ascended from the cold stones of the scullery, not by the grace of a nobleman, but through her own staggering, fiery resilience, proving that the most indelible nobility is born of courage, not bloodline. Together, they laid the ghosts of Rosalind and Nora to rest, turning a history of profound betrayal into a testament of triumphant survival. In the end, the darkest winter of the Duke's life was banished by the girl who refused to let the fire die.